a fun trip to the Baroque world. So Caravaggio, I think many of you are familiar with his work, is a fascinating figure. Someone who was a rather troubled person, rather controversial, a vision that was not like anyone before or since. And his painting is not just the product of the Counter-Reformation, this reinvigoration of the Catholicism in Rome, but also I think of a very distinctive personal approach to light and line and color and composition. Above all, and I think you're going to see this so clearly in his work, he wants to make this material, this Christian narrative, feel contemporary and relevant to the viewers. He wants to draw you right into the story. And that's exactly what he does in his work. Now, he, of course, alludes to the great Renaissance masters. And here we're, of course, looking at the Last Supper, Leonardo's Last Supper. This is only about 100 years earlier, but the Baroque is really a sea change from its predecessors. If you look at something like the Last Supper, you are thinking about ideas of symmetry and geometry and harmony. There is this inner calm, even amidst the announcement of this bombshell that one at this table will betray Christ. But still, there is a sense of calm. There is an intriguing kind of psychology to it. And there is a sense of realism, actually making the table service what was used by the monks at the time at the monastery, but still it's nothing like the Baroque vision, which really wants to draw you right into the artwork. And that's exactly what Caravaggio does. And again, one of his very first religious paintings is this piece. And this is the Rest on the Flight into Egypt from the 1590s. And what we are looking at here is a most unusual interpretation of this theme. This is, of course, the Holy Family on the run as refugees. You can see, again, to your right, the Virgin, kind of restless, but sleeping, a little bit of a furrowed brow. Joseph on the left, an older Joseph, and a huge donkey behind him. We can just see the donkey's eye and part of the donkey's body, united in a kind of a watchfulness over the Virgin. There are so many just fascinating details. The entire piece is, of course, divided in half by the angel, this music maker, who is a really, really unusual detail. And I want you to look at some of the other details. Look at Joseph's feet, in the sense almost of having cold feet, of one foot awkwardly on top of the other. Look at some of the other elements, what they've had to grab as they're running, this little blanket with their possessions and a kind of a flagon under it. Look at also some of the details that anticipate Christ's life to come. You might look at the very, very intentional rocks that are in the path in the foreground, or perhaps the brambles that we see that suggest a crown of thorns. And also, it's a little hard to see, but of course, the donkey, and there is a cross on the donkey's back as well. Mary is tender and real, but also there's a sense of a kind of worry and consternation, again, with that kind of knit brow. Really fascinating. And this, I think, will show you that these interpretations of the scriptures, at least from Caravaggio, are always going to be really unusual and challenging. This is, I wish this was bigger, but this is a detail from his first major religious painting, which is the Calling of Matthew. And this very much puts the biblical story, as is Caravaggio's MO, in present day. So this might not look mind-blowing to us, but I think if you'd seen this in the early 1600s, you would have been quite shocked to see people in contemporary dress being addressed literally by Jesus. We're looking at a kind of a dark, dingy room somewhere in contemporary Rome. We've got a little light coming through those oilskin windows. And at the table, we can see the tax collectors at work. You can see that they're counting coins. There is an account book and an inkwell and a quill and a very contemporary, what is called a Savonarola chair that you can see on the far left side. And even if you didn't understand all of that, the figure with the black hat in the center has a little coin tucked in his hat as well. And that is Matthew. Matthew here, again, is center stage. Rich, kind of nicely dressed. He points at himself. And at that same moment, Jesus and Peter are walking by and they turn and Christ extends one kind of eloquent hand and points again at Matthew as if you follow me. Now you might look at those hands and think they look perhaps a little bit familiar, perhaps particularly Christ. And you'd be right, because that's modeled on the hand of Adam on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And in a sense here, Christ becomes a second Adam. The light is also fascinating. If you look, that there's a slicing kind of diagonal that is right above Christ's head that intersects with the halo and then just comes down and points directly at Matthew. A kind of divine light and a moving symbol too of divine illumination. There are also, you might notice, echoes of the Last Supper in this piece. Matthew, in a sense, is called from the world of Judas to the world of Jesus in this image as well. It depicts a split second in time, and it's a split second in which everything changes if you are paying attention and if you are attentive to this moment of divine interruption. If you look at Matthew is paying attention. The two young men to his right are worried. They look as if they're going to leap up at a second and they don't really know what's happening and who these figures are. And then look to the left of Matthew. Those figures, the young man and the older man, are completely and utterly engrossed in those coins and in the act of counting those coins. They are oblivious to the divine visitor. The others are threatened by that divine visitor. And Matthew is truly the one who's being called to this new world and new life. So really interesting and a very, as I say, kind of dramatic piece. But they're all dramatic. See those hands? You can't miss those hands. And what's interesting is he's reversed the position. It is the exact same pose, but he's turned Adam's hand around a little bit. But any viewer of the time would have been familiar with that gesture and known exactly the illusion that Caravaggio was making. Okay. Another dramatic piece. This is the conversion of Saul. This is Saul of Tarsus, who is the future St. Paul, who was traveling to Damascus with letters of authority to persecute Christians, when he is abruptly stopped, literally in his tracks, by a miracle. He is knocked from his horse and temporarily blinded. The piece, like many of Caravaggio's works, is pared down to the essentials. And often the background is completely dark. Quite intentionally, there's nothing to distract you in the background. He really wants you to focus on the drama and the theatricality of the moment and these powerful sculptural figures. You can see a kind of a delicate ray that strikes Paul, or Saul/Paul, who's been flung violently from his horse towards us, towards the spectator. Now, frequently this image has been depicted by artists, but usually as something kind of noisy and chaotic and maybe a little frightening. Here, what's fascinating is that figure of Paul is not frightened or threatened or worried. What's interesting is that figure on the ground, and again, you've been struck blind and thrown from your horse, frightening events. That figure does not display fear, but instead displays a kind of a receptive heart and a receptive spirit. Look at the pose. The pose is opening arms. And again, a kind of acceptance, a vulnerability, an openness, a readiness to receive. There's a kind of a mystic sense of communion and conversion, a divine love and a receptivity. Really, really unusual. And also I'd note Paul, not old and bearded, but a young soldier here. And this huge heavy horse raising a hoof, trying to avoid trampling Paul, and the groom with his furrowed brow. We get a sense too of that, a very contemporary feel to the piece, and a very earthy one too. The fact that as a viewer, what we're really looking at is this horse's posterior, like the ox and the ass and the donkey we saw earlier in the flight into Egypt. The animal is a huge part of these images and a kind of a patient watcher in these religious dramas of Caravaggio. The piece, this is the martyrdom of Peter. Again, it's an invitation to the viewer into this religious drama. Peter here is on a cross as it is being raised. Dark, dark background. As we saw in the previous piece, nothing to distract me in the background. There is a sense of grittiness and real people and the physical weight and strain of raising a cross like this and lifting the body of an adult man up in this way. You can really see that in the figures. If you look at the figure, all quite faceless. The figure who has the rope over his back, can't see the face at all, and the incredible strain of raising that cross. The other one, you can see the kind of the veins and popping out and the tendons popping out on the arm and the kind of reddish hands. And then the other figure is just presenting us again with this backside and the straining legs and arms, that elbow coming right out into our space. And there's a kind of again, a kind of a gritty reality to it, and a kind of this faceless quality to the horror and the violence, that you really can't see who is doing this to him. Look at the dirty feet. And again, this kind of the idea of that big dirty foot in your face. And again, just something so, I don't know, realistic and horrifyingly commonplace about this whole thing. And we are, as viewers, brought right into the image. His eyes, if you look at Peter's eyes, they are fixed on what would have been the chapel's altar, as this would have been hanging above it, as if, I think, to stress for us that death, this martyrdom is part of his journey. But even as his blood is being shed, he is also guiding us as the viewer to look right down on that altar as well and be thinking about being saved by the experience of what is happening on the altar. There is a big rock in the foreground. Can you see that underneath the elbow? A symbol, again, of the enduring faith. And again, the cornerstone of the church. Peter is the rock upon which the church is built. The light falls on Peter and these straining figures as his executioners go about their business, and a very grim business it is. But what a fascinating way to show us this narrative. Entombment, another piece from 1604. This should remind you of many things, but maybe particularly of Michelangelo's Pietà. You can really get a sense here of the dead weight of Jesus's body, this adult male corpse, weighing heavily on those who are struggling to hold it. John strains not to drop him, and Nicodemus is kind of awkwardly trying to clasp the body in a kind of a bear hug. The emphasis, again, look at the bare, dirty feet that are coming out into our space. There is a little sense of new life as we see a little bit of the bottom. It's hard to see in the dark. The dock plant, new hope of life in that darkness of the grave. I'd like you to look at the way the figures respond in varying ways. Mary, both Marys, raising hands, reaching to the heavens, emoting. There is, again, a kind of a gritty realism to this. When you think about this as an altarpiece, we realize that Caravaggio has put us below this piece. So as a viewer, if this piece is above us, we are in the position of, compositionally receiving the body of Christ. If we are down in the tomb and the body is about to be handed to us. As we've seen in many of his other pieces, he loves to bring the action, the composition right out into our space. If you look at the man in the orange coat, again, we're looking at his legs, the tendons, and the feet, but also look at that elbow that's pushing right out into our space with the kind of frayed and worn area of the elbow in the coat. And he is looking to us to receive this body. It is such a dramatic piece. And again, as with all of his works, it's not like anybody else has interpreted this piece. It's a real new way of seeing in many ways. This is a favorite, Supper at Emmaus. And there are, of course, many, many different artists interpret this piece. And Caravaggio's, I think, is a favorite. And this is the story where, again, Caravaggio is giving us the incident where this is post-crucifixion. Two of the disciples are walking a long road, a 7-mile journey to Emmaus, in a state of confusion and probably emotional exhaustion, and really just spent with what has happened in the last few days with the death, the crucifixion of their leader. A stranger falls in step with them, and they explain to the stranger just what has happened, and that their hopes have been dashed. And of course, the stranger, what do you know? Listens to this, gives them a bit of a scripture lesson, and they stop. They stop at the inn for the evening, encourage the stranger to stay with them. They break bread, and in that split second, that moment, the blessing and the breaking of the bread, that stranger is revealed to them as the risen Christ. So it is that split second, just as we saw in the calling of Matthew, in which everything changes. And everything changes if you are paying attention. We're here looking also at a contemporary scene, probably a scene in some rough Roman tavern. If you want, hope you'll notice this is the very same chair that we saw earlier, that Savonarola chair that was in Calling of Matthew, which must have been a chair in Caravaggio's studio, which is on the left side of this piece. And I want you to look at some of the other details. For starters, as we mentioned before, again, dark background, very, very plain, nothing to distract us. Look at the two disciples now. The one who is on the left with the dark hair, slightly younger, cannot believe it. He's pushing up on the armrests, kind of pushing up and back, and is just in a state of shock. That gesture is so forceful. Can you see that the coat is torn, and we can see peeking through his jacket, that little slip of white from his shirt. He simply cannot believe what he's seeing. Now, the other disciple on the right side also is simply stunned. Notice that gesture again of reaching out, a gesture that can mean many things, I believe. A gesture that says amazement, a gesture, I cannot believe it. But you might also look at that gesture and realize that the disciple might be saying, the last time I saw you, you were, and then mimicking the crucifixion. So many, many details and suggestions there. You'll notice that, again, contemporary feel, the modern chair, the modern clothing. And on the older disciple, can you see the little shell, which would have been a modern symbol of a pilgrim going to Santiago de Compostela. So another contemporary detail in this piece. I also want you to look at the table, that kind of funny little chicken, the fruit that is long past its prime, and the bread. And perhaps you'll notice in that basket of fruit, a couple of things. One is that it seems to be falling off the table, seems to be just, we just need to go and push it right back on. And you might notice too, to the right of that basket of fruit, do you see a little unusual shadow? To the right of the basket of fruit is the shadow of what looks to be a fish. So the ancient Christian symbol. I think in many ways, Caravaggio wants to set a place at the table for us and has created space. This is a huge piece with life-size figures. And in a sense, we, the viewer, are invited to pull up a chair and be part of this group. And I think one of the many ways that he reinforces that, besides having this empty space for us, is taking something like that fruit basket and pushing it right off the table so that we want to scooch up, push that back on, and join this group. So really, really a fascinating thing. Look at the innkeeper too, who seems to be, I think, quite oblivious to what is going on. Doesn't really know what is happening. And in another second, the image will be different and Christ will have disappeared. So very, very dramatic piece. And again, many others have interpreted this, but I think this is one of the most theatrical and just engaging images of the supper at Emmaus. This is another piece that probably you've seen, Doubting Thomas. After the crucifixion, of course, Jesus did appear, as we just saw, to those two disciples and several others, but he had not appeared to Thomas. And Thomas said, well, frankly, I won't believe it until I actually see and can put my finger in the wounds. And about a week later, Christ does reappear to them in the upper room and said, okay. So gently, as you can see in this piece, this is rather hard and somewhat squeamish to look at, but takes Thomas's hand and patiently, but firmly guides it into the wounds. This is a very favorite topic of many artists. Usually it's a bigger scene, a crowd scene, and usually what you'd see is Christ raising hands and saying, see here, here's a little wound, and pointing it to it. There's nothing like this kind of gritty, visceral realism as you see in this piece. Caravaggio takes those four heads with their furrowed, three of them with very furrowed brows, and creates a tight little diamond. We're not looking at anything to distract us in the background, but we're looking at those four little heads and focusing on them and their reactions and their, look at Thomas. He's not really looking at the wound. He seems to be looking beyond it, almost to another world in this moment of kind of epiphany and revelation. It is a piece of such kind of shocking realism and sober intensity that I still don't think there's anything quite like this. These disciples, very much like the others that we've seen, are real people, contemporary clothing, torn jackets, something very, very accessible and approachable about these disciples. This is the Death of the Virgin, which is one of Caravaggio's more controversial pieces. And I think you can see why. Never before in Christian painting had Mary looked like this. She had not looked as frail, as vulnerable, in death and kind of bloated. She's here wearing a simple red dress, which is unlaced at the bodice to make her more comfortable. And she's just stretched on this kind of makeshift bier, this piece of wood. The apostles have gathered around, and you can read their pain and sorrow and grief. And those nearest her are just, they're just convulsed with just grief and despair. They're crying, they're covering their eyes. Two stare just intently at her prone body, almost as if in contemplation of the miracle within that mortal. Caravaggio seems to express in every one of these the kind of the, if you want of a better word, messiness of actual life. These grieving souls jammed into this very crowded space, to honor her and to express their feelings. Mary's last thoughts, we don't know, may have been of that miraculous birth, because quite intentionally, I think he's giving us her hand resting gently on that slightly swollen belly. There's a tiny, very, very thin little halo around her head. And as if to reinforce the idea again, there is a copper basin, which I know we are to think of as an empty vessel, that is in the bottom of the picture, kind of a little bit hard to see, but an empty copper pan right at the bottom. The red drapery is also quite intentional, and I think suggests that rising upwards to the next life as well. Really fascinating. There are very, very few Caravaggios certainly in North America. There are many in Europe, and one of the very few that is in any collection in the United States or outside of Europe, believe it or not, is in Kansas City. So this is an old friend. This is at the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. And again, most unusual to be able to see one of these in person. This is John the Baptist, a contemplative, young, non-bearded John the Baptist with the staff that echoes the shepherd's cross, the rich red drapery, and of course the animal skins as well. Something of the intensity of purpose, of seriousness of character is apparent here. That kind of brooding figure. Also that life of the wilderness, the little dock plants at his feet. And again, he's in the wilderness, the voice crying in the wilderness. Also, that theme we see repeatedly is that gritty realism. And some were offended, of course, by this big dirty foot that you see in the bottom and the dirty toenails as well. But Caravaggio always wanted things to be accessible and real to his audience, and to have them connect these scriptural stories with real lives and with the lives of viewers. This is the arrest and betrayal of Christ. The contrast here is fascinating. That pale, delicate, very sensitive face of Christ against, if you look, the kind of brutish, sunburned, furrowed brow of Judas. A sense of sorrow and resignation if you look at the hands in the foreground of Jesus. And then Judas, looking so conflicted, seems to lament, kind of stares into space like a person haunted by guilt. And then look at the reactions again of those disciples who are, disclaiming us. Look at the one in the green screaming and running away from the sight. And that I think says it all. And then, of course, the figures in armor coming for him. As we saw in the earlier pieces, this has a contemporary feel. This was not obviously armor that one would have seen 2,000 years ago. This was armor that you would have seen in the 16th century and early 17th century. So it really keeps it consistent with Caravaggio's idea of giving you a contemporary version of these stories as well. And nothing, I think, could be more contemporary than seeing the armor and the visors on these soldiers who are arresting Christ. A couple more that would show you. One is the raising of Lazarus. This is a story that probably you know as well. Lazarus is the brother of Martha and Mary. And he is ill. They are friends of Jesus. The sisters send for Jesus and say, well, can you come and heal the brother? He delays. He does not appear. The brother dies and is entombed. And the sisters are, needless to say, quite put out when Jesus does arrive on the scene, but he does not seem to be worried about this. They go to the tomb, and indeed, he says, roll away the stone. and he raises Lazarus. So it is in many ways an anticipation of his own resurrection, and it's one of his, I think it's actually the last miracle performed by Christ. Much of this piece is also dark in the background. We have that same eloquent gesture of Christ reaching out to raise the dead man, the sisters hovering over their brother, and then that figure whose pose, once again, anticipates the pose of crucifixion, but also the disciple at supper at Emmaus, the pose of kind of receptivity as well. It's very, very dramatic and mysterious piece. And you can see something of the curiosity and the wonder on the faces of the other who are in this setting with him, and so this miraculous occurrence of the raising of Lazarus. I'm going to show you just a couple more images. So let's see if I got, oh, that's it. So unusual about Caravaggio. And it's not just, I think, the drama and the theatrical use of light and color and line, but it's wanting to bring the viewer right into the story, or pushing that story right out into your space. It's taking this whole Christian narrative to a whole nother level to make you a part of the story and make it a contemporary story that for him was not 1600 years old, but a story that was really about the modern world and about people of faith reacting to and responding to these stories. But he does it in such an unusual way that I have to say, I don't think any artists before or since have interpreted things really in the same way that he has, and brought the viewer into the subjects in the same way that Caravaggio has. So if he is an artist, I hope you will return to his works. And if he is an artist who is new to you, I hope you will explore some of them. And the next time you are traveling, if anybody is in the area of Kansas City, John the Baptist is definitely worth a visit. And I encourage you again to explore these if you don't know them, because they are never cease to fascinate and to inspire as well. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them, if I can answer them. I look so forward to finally seeing you all in person when you come to look at the Marie Watt and the Pliny shows, which will be, I believe, next month. So are there other questions or thoughts or?
Carol?
Yes.
I wasn't aware of how the decision was made to focus on Caravaggio in this particular episode. Was that because you were working on something, or was that Barbara's interest? How did this particular presentation come about?
I think that my friend Barbara Nasanchek asked what else was in the larder, and mentioned that this was something that was in the larder, and she said, yes, please. So that was why I wish we had something related to this. I have done, Betsy, so many talks on other aspects of Western art history, and they may or may not be anything that's represented here, but there are things that I've done, with Leonardo or Rembrandt many, many times. And this is one of those. And of course, when I was at the Nelson Atkins, that was a big part of the collection. So that was something that I've had to speak about for a number of years. And Barbara said that would be of interest. So that's why we landed upon this. But sadly, no, there's no Caravaggio here to see. I wish.
I think that there's probably a lot of realism going on outside the Johnson Museum today, though.
Yes, there is excessive realism. Yes. Even more tomorrow.
For those of you who don't know what I'm referring to, today is Slope Day at Cornell.
Actually, tomorrow is Slope
Day.
Tomorrow. But I think it's already started, right, Betsy. I think it's
yes, it definitely starts before.
A lot of people in shorts and t-shirts. Let's put it that way.
It's tomorrow. Yeah.
Yes.
It used to be on Yeah, it used to be on Fridays until Cornell decided a few years ago to end on Wednesdays, and so slope days are on Wednesday now.
But I think it's just, for those of you who are so familiar with this, it's much better than it used to be. It's more controlled, and there's things seem to be kind of fenced off, and you have to have your little name or your wristband. So hopefully the third graders coming tomorrow will not have an extra educational experience that they did not sign up for.
It's just a whole week of revelry from Grateful Dead, Covenant, whatever it was, right into
Yes.
slope
Yeah,
day.
and I think it used to be so much, I don't know, it seemed like it used to be worse. So I feel like they're trying desperately to kind of keep it under control.
are.
now. So
They
we
are.
will hope that that is the case and people will be safe as can be. I hope. I hope.
People used to, at the hospital, hope for a rainy day, so there would not be as large a turnout. I mean, it's,
Yeah, but
it's a
but sadly,
problem.
Barbara, it's going to be a gorgeous day. So I don't.
Yes, it's going to be beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the parking would have been impossible for us.
Yes,
It's hard
absolutely.
enough on a usual day.
Yeah, but hopefully the parking will be much, much better when you come next month.
Right.
So Barbara has been so helpful with, between you and Barbara choosing programs of interest, but I'm kind of curious, what else is in the hopper or in the larder, as you said?
What else is in the larder? Well, let's see, virtual or in person?
I would say virtual, well, actually both, because, but virtual, because I think this, these programs have been so interesting and so easy to access,
Good. Well, I think one that we just did for the class of 66, that might be of interest. The class of 66 had asked the top 10 teaching pieces. And I said, well, I can only answer that from my perspective. So we did one that was the top 10 teaching pieces that connected to Cornell's core values and the environment. So that's kind of fun. So that,
Well, that sounds like a really good one to maybe
that would
start
be-
with.
that
in
would be easy. That
fall.
would be, it's done. So that would be easy. And some
Right.
things maybe you do know already, and some may be new pieces to you, but that would be very easy to do.
Well, that sounds really interesting. They all sound interesting, to tell you the truth, but it's just if you've got them in the larder,
Yes,
and
yes.
why
Well,
would we
it's-
not
it's
raid
hard
the
to fill
larder?
the larder. Betsy, it's very hard to fill the larder. This has been, and I think Barbara knows, this has been the first full on in-person school year for us since 2018-19, which is wonderful and extraordinary, but starting it all up in person, that's been another exciting challenge with I'm guessing probably over 6,000 kids so far, and that might end up to be, well, I don't know if we'll hit 7,000, but this has been a very good year where we've both gone out into schools and then schools have come here. So that's kept us busy.
Wow, that's great.
It's very exciting. Very
Well,
exciting.
I'm speaking on behalf of Love Living at Home, partly because, I'm now one of the 3 co-chairs. We call ourselves the triumvirate of the program committee, and these have been absolutely. I knew nothing about art history, and now
Well,
everything I know is from you.
Well, I'm utterly delighted to do it, and I will continue in person and virtually as long as if anybody remembers that I'm supposed to be K-12 and reminds me, well, we'll see. So far, nobody has remembered that, so we will keep going. We will keep going until someone stops us. But I love doing it. I love doing
Carol,
it.
our art knowledge is definitely, for most of us, is in the K-12 range, or maybe the K-6 range.
Well, it is just, it's so fun to learn and look again, especially if it's something you've seen before and think, oh, I never thought about it this way or that way. I think that one of the many, many joys of this job is you're always learning and always teaching, and the things that any student can teach you, you think, well, I've looked at that 100 times, but there's always a new vision and a fresh vision that you think, there's a new angle. And I think that's what it's all about.
I
And
think also as we're thinking about the summer and taking trips, we should remember that there are some gems of art museums in upstate New York There are 2 in Buffalo that are fantastic. Rochester's Memorial Art Gallery,
And the
Syracuse's Everson, Canajahare next to the library has its own collection of wonderful works that were collected down in Elmira. I mean, it's all worth a day trip to each
Right.
of those cities
Absolutely.
and more in
the East-
Cooperstown.
And the Eastman House, don't forget that wonderful.
Oh, the
Eastman House.
Eastman House is fabulous.
Yeah. So there is so much, and of course in Corning, the Corning Museum of Glass and the Rockwell, they're fascinating as well. So
Right.
lots of things. And again, I've not been to the Binghamton University Art Gallery. Have you been there, Barbara?
No,
Okay, because that might be worth
Right.
it too.
and Syracuse University has its own art gallery too.
Right?
I
Yeah.
love this painting that you have up. It's really special. I mean, it's so calm and
Yeah, it's just, there's something so fascinating about him. And, he's such a troubled character too,
Oh,
but it's
yeah.
such a
Yeah,
fascinating. Yeah.
didn't
and I
even
think
go
about-
into that.
Oh, yeah, I was gonna say, I think I read a wonderful quote once that more was known about him from police blotters than any other single source. And I thought, I'm sure we'd have a diagnosis for him today, but he did have a lot of personal issues. That's for sure.
Yes. Well, thank you so much,
Well,
Carol.
my
We
pleasure.
look
And
forward
again,
to seeing you in person in June.
all right, can't wait. Can't wait. Look forward. All right, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Was it as quick as I thought it would be?